Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. Today I'm going to talk to you about the start of the pandemic. Well, not just the start of the pandemic, but the pandemic over the first couple years. I want to first just acknowledge that the pandemic was traumatic, it was difficult, it was challenging. And even though we're not at that height of our pandemic response, we're in a pandemic recovery. It hasn't disappeared. And many of you are grappling with challenges, health challenges, employment challenges, disruption, how do I work, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to acknowledge that even though this is we're moving into this different phase of the pandemic, it's not over. On today's episode of Misperceived, I'm going to talk to you about, is it a misperception that the pandemic actually made work and home and life worse for women? Or was it just showcasing back to us the worlds we already were living in? Did it just give us a mirror to show us what we already were experiencing? I'm going to tell you that I've studied gender inequality in the US and around the world for over 20 years. And when the pandemic hit, I was worried. I was, of course, afraid because I, like many of you, didn't know what was coming. But I was very worried about what this was going to mean for women specifically. I have never seen anything that was so incredibly disruptive to women in particular and mothers specifically. And the things I worried about were, are we going to see an incredible loss in decades and decades of progress, moving women into higher status positions, into employment, into better economic opportunity? And what would that mean in the long term? So I think one of the questions is, I know that we're in this period of time where we're talking about post-pandemic periods, we're talking about recoveries, and we're trying to get quote unquote back to normal, or we're thinking about what is the new normal. However, one of the things I want to stress is that this period of time was terrible for a lot of mothers. And the reason is that during the closures, there were kind of three things that happened for mothers. One was that mothers were in these industries that were disproportionately impacted by the closures. So they were working in the bars, or they were working in the childcare centers, or they were the teachers, or they were the flight attendants who had this incredible amount of disruption that happened. The second thing is that schools got closed. And schools are a really critical lifeline for mothers' employment. Now, it's a critical lifeline for everyone's employment, obviously. I mean, we all need schools to be open so that our children can be there during our work hours. But they're also this critical point of education, and it's this childcare infrastructure that got erased for a lot of mothers. And so during this period of time, one of the things we were really interested in asking was, what's happening for mothers? What's happening when schools go remote? What's happening when schools are in person? What's happening when schools are hybrid? Because a lot of mothers were sharing through to us during the pandemic when we were doing the interviews that it was unsustainable, right? That they were there, they all of a sudden became the teacher and they were the worker, and they were trying to signal to their employer that they were still doing a good job, but then they were also teaching their children algebra. We talked to mothers who had neurodivergent children, and were saying it was so hard once schools disappeared, because the school was the structure and the school was the place where people were trained to educate children with diverse needs in the appropriate ways. And all of a sudden, mothers were there stepping into this role. And the question was like, is it just going to be mothers? So like, what happened in some of your families, right? Maybe you felt this intuitively or innately. What happened to mothers? And did it feel totally different to what was happening for fathers? we would think at this period of time, like everyone would step in. And our data shows that, right? Like we actually show that fathers did pick up more housework and they did pick up more childcare. And when we looked in countries like Australia, right, where fathers picked up more of the housework and childcare for a longer period of time, they reported worse sleep and they reported more anxiety and they reported more stress. And so for many, fathers were kind of stepping into these new roles and they were doing more work and they were managing work and family in the ways that women long have. And they're stressed and their health suffered. But what was interesting is in the US, fathers picked up this additional labor at the start and then they dropped it. So it left mothers with the bulk of this labor. We did a survey during this period of time and we looked at the US and Australia and we looked over time, right? We were looking at the start of 2020 and then we went into later in 2020 and then we went into 2021 and then we kept going, right? We were trying to get multiple time points to see, yeah, okay, men are stepping into more, but are they holding it? And the answer was the fathers held it at first and then they dropped it. Now, I'm not here to say fathers did the right or wrong thing. I think at that moment in time, there was incredible pressure to be economic providers. There was an incredible pressure on insecurity about what was going to happen. But what we found was it really mattered what state you lived in. And so women across the US, mothers across the US were having very different experiences depending upon which state they reside. If you lived in the US during this time, this is in no way surprising, right? This was a really kind of polarizing moment in which states did different things. They responded differently to the pandemic. And what we found was that whether the states had in-person learning versus whether they went remote versus whether they were hybrid had a significant impact on mothers' employment. So if you lived in a state like Maryland, where at the start of the pandemic, it was fully remote, we saw that mothers' employment dropped by 16 percentage points. We didn't actually see that fathers' employment changed, right? It was still high, but mothers were the ones who were stepping out of employment and stepping into the childcare and stepping into the homeschooling and stepping into the housework, and they were holding it for a longer period of time. Many mothers were still balancing employment, and that's really stressful. But a lot of mothers just had to withdraw because it was too much. It's not true that all mothers did, though. This was particularly true for those with less education, mothers with a high school diploma or less were the most likely to be impacted by this. And 16 percentage points drop, right? So we're seeing different experiences. I just want to point out that okay, so for many of us, we saw this as through a political lens, but I wrote this book before the pandemic in which I was really interested in what does childcare look like across states, right? Thinking that what I would find is this my home state, the state of California, would just be shown to be exceptional. That we would be the most progressive, that we would have the best childcare infrastructure, and that we would be the best because we had this paid parental leave policy and we have highly educated women and more women are employed and it's the state of opportunity. And what I found through this book was that actually was totally not true, that those West Coast states are actually really good at empowering women, but really bad at childcare infrastructure, that they have childcare that is super expensive, difficult to access, their school days are shorter, after school care is difficult to get. And so California and the Oregons and the Washingtons of the world are very good at giving women a lot of education and giving them economic opportunity, but they're not good at supporting them in their infrastructure. And what was interesting is when the pandemic came, it was the states like California and Oregon and Washington that went fully remote, right? And held that remote school into longer periods of time. Now, I know this was complicated and there were a lot of reasons why schools went remote and women's employment and mothers' employment was not the only factor. But I just want to point out that this is a pattern that I established before and then it came through during the pandemic. And the result of that was that more mothers were out of employment. And if they closed in 2020, then they also had this kind of reduced employment into 2021. So was it in fact a misperception that COVID made the world worse for women, or did it just expose the incredible stress and strain that women had long been carrying? For many women, it was the second. It was this realization that they were on their own to solve all of the problems for the family while also keeping their careers going and protecting everyone from infection, risk, death. And them assuming this labor, it freed up men and fathers to maintain their careers, to step back into work, and to return to the office when the offices opened up. We saw a lot of women quit during this period of time, high, successful, important women exit employment. But we also saw a lot of women struggle, those with fewer resources, those with more demanding and more grueling schedules who still can't step back into employment or still are managing the long-term legacies of long COVID or disrupted employment or childcare that was there during the pandemic, but now is gone. So this is showing back to us the incredible stress and strain that we've asked women to carry for a long period of time. Jess Calarco, a sociologist, talks about other countries have safety nets when things go wrong, and the US has mothers. That mothers are the safety net. But that begs the question, what if the load is so heavy that they can't carry it too? And is it fair to ask mothers to carry it all, or should we be there sharing the load? This is what the pandemic showed us. So as we move into the recovery, my wish for you, listener, is that we see this for what it is. We acknowledge that it was a trauma. We see that many of us are still carrying the stress and the strain and the burnout of it all. And that for many, it's difficult to share what that looked like or felt like because it's happening in our intimate partnerships. It's happening with the people we love and care about the most. And so how can you share the break when the location of the break or the source of the break is your family? You're not alone in that feeling. And I think a lot of mothers are feeling that way. We'd like to hear what you feel or how you're experiencing it. Share that through. As per always, thank you for listening to Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD, you just get to hang out with me. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.